So our text for our message this morning comes from Matthew 7, the third chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. We'll read verses 1 through 5. So Matthew 7, beginning at verse 1. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Thus far, our text. Brothers and sisters, as time passes, it seems that the culture that surrounds our church knows less and less about Christianity. Most people have never picked up a Bible, and very few would know more than the simplest details about Jesus. But there are a few Bible passages that do have a lasting presence in our culture. We think of the Lord's Prayer, we think of the Ten Commandments. Most North Americans, if not all of them, would know of these passages. But perhaps the most famous passage in our culture is the passage we're reading today. Right, Matthew 7, verse 1, which I like to translate in an Old English as, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Nearly all North Americans know about this passage, and they love this passage. And what's more, they often use this passage, or at least they use what they think this passage means. And of course, while it's good that this passage is famous, it's good when biblical teaching is famous, the tragedy is that unfortunately this passage is not well understood and certainly misused regularly. And that is tragic, because today, as we walk through this sermon, you'll see that if properly understood, this passage actually is incredibly practical and speaks to really every person. And if we connect it to the gospel, we'll find it very convicting in how it turns us to Jesus. So today I invite you to walk with me as we consider "Judge not, lest ye be judged," and why we need to discern. We'll see in the first point. And number 2, we'll see why we often judge unfairly. And number 3, judging in the light of Jesus. So, let's read our first verse, or at least begin reading it, which the NIV translation reads as, "Do not judge." And I'll stop there. I'm going to stop there with "do not judge." Why? Because that's where most people, when they read this passage, stop. At least in their mind. Christian or not. Because how often do we hear in our culture, "Do not judge," or "Don't judge me"? It's such a refrain these days. And people say, our society should be a judgment-free zone. People shouldn't form judgments on anyone else's behavior or opinions at all. In fact, there's even a famous song from the rapper Chris Brown called "Don't Judge Me." And I'll read some of the lyrics to you. It goes like this. "So please don't judge me, and I won't judge you, because it could get ugly before it gets beautiful. And then, if you love me, then let it be beautiful. I've been through this so many times, let's just change the subject." What he's saying is, if you love me, you won't judge me. But really what he means is, if you love me, you won't form an opinion on what I've done or who I am at all. And the corollary being, I deserve and will only accept positive evaluations of who I am and what I've done. And this is the basic fundamental belief most people carry in our society. We're not allowed to judge anyone negatively ever. Now we should ask the question, is that what Jesus is saying in our passage when he says, don't judge? Is Jesus saying that we should never form an opinion or a judgment about another person? And I think we have to, if we read the passage, we'll discover, and if we read the rest of Scripture, we'll discover, no, that's not what Jesus means. And we don't even need to go to Jesus' teaching to recognize the folly of Chris Brown's way of thinking. Let's judge it on its own merits for a second. Let's think of Chris Brown. In 2009, Chris Brown is charged in court and pleads guilty to assaulting his girlfriend. Now, we're not here to glory in that. It's obviously a terrible affair. But the point is this. If we live by Chris Brown's song, Don't Judge Me, aka don't ever have an opinion on what I do, then how do we deal with this violent assault? Should we, as he says in his song, ignore the subject and just let the relationship be beautiful? But he himself has destroyed the beauty in his relationship with his girlfriend. And so, here's the key point. Chris Brown's girlfriend or next girlfriend has to make judgments about his actions and his character for her own safety. Because what if he does it again? And so here we realize that our society's way of thinking is fundamentally inconsistent and flawed. It doesn't work. We actually have to make judgments about other people at some point. The question is not, should I make a judgment about other people and their actions? The question is, how and why and how fair and what standards do I use? And so we see that, and we're going to see in this passage, that Jesus is not teaching us we should never judge, because we have to. In fact, in other parts of Scripture, Jesus, or the Bible rather, clearly teaches us that judging is necessary and in fact commanded. Or at least some form of judgment, and we'll get to that. Think of John 7, verse 24. Jesus is responding to the Pharisees in this passage, and he says, "Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly." So don't judge wrongly, but there is a way you should judge rightly. Or again, as we read Matthew 18, verse 15, it says, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault. Well, how do you point out someone's fault if you haven't judged that there's a fault? It's a command. If your brother or sister sins, go point out. Go, do it. And so judgment is obviously required. And then even in Matthew 7, verse 6, you'll see the verse after our text here. Most unusual verse, right, where it says, do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. I haven't included this because there's a lot in here. But basically the gist of that verse is, be careful who you share the gospel with and who you share the Sermon on the Mount with. Discriminate carefully among your listeners, because certain listeners who listen to the gospel will trample all over you in the gospel, and it's not worth it. And so you have to discriminate between your listeners for who will actually take it seriously and who will not. Judgment. And so when Jesus is saying do not judge, what he's really saying is don't judge unfairly or wrongly. Now, of course, we should still ask the question, why do people get the impression that Jesus says we should never, ever judge? Well, I think the major reason is because the word for judgment can be used in two different ways. That's true in the original language, and that's true in English. Right? Because judging can mean to analyze, evaluate, or discern on the one hand, or it can mean condemn on the other hand, and sort of sit in judgment and determine someone's character, essential character or worth. And so we always make judgments about which product is better in the store, on the one hand, or on the other hand, a judge pronounces a sentence on a person. And so it's obvious that what Jesus is really getting at is he's saying we need to be discerning, analyzing, and evaluating people. But condemnation is not good. And we'll work that out a little bit more. And I think that's one of the reasons people, when they see do not judge, they say don't sit in judgment on other people and condemn them. And people get uneasy with that. But we do need to evaluate and discern. So, this is our second point. Why is it, though, that judging unfairly is such a big issue? We've established that we can judge, let me rephrase that. We've established that we can judge, but then what is Jesus actually saying in our passage? What's he trying to say with judge not lest ye be judged? What is that? And let's read more of our passage to sort of gain an answer on that. Right, look what he says. If you read the NIV, it says, do not judge or you too will be judged. And then in verse 2, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And so what we're really seeing here, brothers and sisters, is that, Jesus gives us a window to judge. We're allowed to evaluate other people, in fact, commanded. The problem is that we as human beings with our greedy, selfish, sinful little hearts, we take that little window that Jesus gives us and we drive a freight train through that thing. Because we love to judge other people. We don't just judge sometimes. We're people who love to form negative, critical, unfair judgments about other people. Every one of us has experienced this and done this. And this is what Jesus is getting. He's getting at this tendency of human beings to judge people rashly and unfairly and hypercritically. We love to tear down other people and think the worst of them and to make ourselves judges. We all do it. Every one of us. And it's in the church, outside the church, it's everywhere. Sometimes the church can be even worse sometimes on this point. In some ways, this is what we call a sin of religious people, although certainly it's everywhere in the world. In fact, there's a reason why Jesus includes this now in the Sermon on the Mount, right? This is the third chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. And what Jesus has in this chapter is sort of these concluding statements almost. So if you learn the previous two chapters, then the comments of chapter 7 sort of explain how to live them a bit more. And one of the commentators says this. He says, one of the dangers in becoming a disciple of the Sermon on the Mount is, and he says this, he says, the challenge to be holy has been taken seriously, right? And now there's a fair degree of discipline and service and formal obedience in your life if you want to live like Jesus. And then, now that you're living the Sermon on the Mount, you're becoming like Jesus, what happens? Well, Carson says, I can afford to look down my long nose at my less disciplined peers and colleagues. So, we start growing as Christians, we start learning to live like Jesus, and then the temptation, but that person hasn't come as far as me. So Jesus is saying, just because you've begun to learn what I've taught you, don't for a second think that you can now begin to judge those who haven't. And in fact, a modern example of this would be, like you've heard of something like life renewal, like a course that you can take in the churches. And often what happens at life renewal, people go through the 27 weeks of life renewal, they have experienced change in their life, and then they start looking down on people who haven't gone to life renewal. It's exactly what's going on in this passage. But if we're honest, it can go the other way too. Often people who feel inferior to other people will become hypercritical people. I mean, if you feel inferior to other people, then you kind of have two options of dealing with that thinking, right? Or that issue. Your first way of dealing with it is that you genuinely acknowledge that this person maybe has advanced further than you. Maybe they are more mature than you. And you praise that person and you accept that. But a lot of us, we don't like that very much. And we take option two. We say, well, actually, they seem better than me, but maybe they're not. And we find a way to set a false standard, and we tear them down and judge them in order to bring them down to our level. And of course, the problem with strategy number two, and this is one of the things Jesus is so critical of, is that you're not, by tearing people around you who may be more mature than you down to your level, you fail to grow. It's extremely harmful. Or in one other example, sometimes unfair judgment is driven by people who've been really hurt in the past. And people, instead of working through their pain in light of forgiveness in Jesus, people instead become hypercritical and they want to tear everyone down as a way of catharsis for their pain. And that this happens quite often as well. But the point is, we judge people unfairly a lot, and it's driven by our motives. And I want to work through this a little bit more. If you still wonder whether you judge people unfairly, let's walk through the following scenarios, and we'll see whether you can put yourself in them. I'll think of a few ways in which we judge people. My favorite is our attitudes towards health and COVID-19. We all have opinions on COVID, don't we? And we, of course, are easily frustrated with those who disagree with us. It's fine to disagree. It's fine even to see another person's opinion and say, I don't think that's the right opinion, and to form a judgment. That's fine. The problem is, in our frustration, we often make unfair and unwarranted judgments about the other people, like the following. That person must be an idiot to think that. Words that I've heard. Or, wow, if they think that, they must be, hear the judgment, a terrible Christian. They don't understand the gospel. Or, here's another one. They're just a bunch of sheep. They haven't learned to think for themselves. They're just lemmings. It's a Facebook or a favorite Facebook charge. Another one is wealth and poverty. Wealthier people will often say about poor people just need to get their act together. If only they worked as hard as me, then they wouldn't be poor. Which, in some cases, might be true, but often is not. I mean, think about it. Those of us who are wealthier, where did our wealth really come from again? Do we honestly think, as wealthier people, that our wealth came from our own effort? No doubt our own effort contributed, but who gave us the health, the good health, to pursue wealth? Who gave us the education? And for those of us in the church, especially, who gave us the good family and the values and the Christian education and the opportunities that brothers and sisters in the church gave you to get you started? Who gave you all that? Who decided that you would be born here and not Somalia? And so the wealthy, when they judge the poor, have no excuse at all, because usually and often, and not always, but often, there are reasons for why people have the poverty they do. We don't know those reasons. But the poor are not immune from this. The poor judge unfairly too. The poor often secretly think that if you're wealthy, it must be because you've cut corners somewhere or done something unethical. They assume it's impossible to become wealthy without some type of unethical business dealing. Rash, unfair, negative judgment, and it's everywhere. One commentator spoke of how many congregation members feast on roast preacher every Sunday. I enjoyed that one. But, Christians are perfectly capable of judging each other on other petty things as well, like clothing, what people wear to church. Well, that person doesn't dress up as much as me. They take God less seriously than I do. Or what time people show up to church. Or sometimes we judge other churches. We say, that other church, it can't be faithful because it doesn't have the history and the confessional documents that we have. And of course, outside the church, it's everywhere, right? We always assess our coworkers somehow. Oh, my boss is lazy. He comes to work later than I do. Or that woman in the office she's kind of slutty. I mean, look what she wears. It's pretty common. Or our discussions over racism. The group with advantages, so to speak, thinks that all members of a minority group are just a bunch of complainers. The group that suffers from racism thinks that every person with advantages must be racist, and that all those people, all they want to do is hold down the minority. That's what they want. And of course, there are cases in which the judgment is accurate, but we just have to seem to want to elevate them to blanket judgments over everybody, and nobody gets anywhere. Or, my favorite, how about our opinion of politicians? How often do we form judgments about our politicians, and especially their motives? I mean, let's think about a conspiracy theory for a second here. What is a conspiracy theory, if not a judgment, an unfair judgment? Conspiracy theories, by definition, are unfair, unfounded, evidenceless judgments about the motives of people we do not know. There's no way. If people judged you by the same standard that you judge politicians, how would you do? If they lived 300 kilometers away from you and only saw your picture on Facebook and a few Facebook posts and decided to say that you must be controlled by some sort of cabal somewhere, you wouldn't pass that test. And so, judgment, it's everywhere. And we could go on a lot longer, couldn't we? I wanted to go through the range of what fits under this text to show you how much this text applies to so much of what we do. But again, why do we do it? We spoke a little bit about it, but now let's talk about what Jesus says about it, why we do it. And this comes in the next few verses. Hey, let's read verses. Let's start at verse 2 again. Look carefully at what Jesus says in verse 2. He says, look, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And so Jesus is saying, listen, the fundamental human tendency is to make false standards. Or maybe even use real standards but apply them unfairly. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about a standard or a measure that we use. So Jesus is saying, listen, most human beings have a problem with forming false measurements of other people. And Jesus says, listen, the second you form a measurement to measure other people that's not God's law, you got a problem. Because whatever measurement you use against other people, if you applied it to yourself, you would fail. In fact, the problem goes deeper than that. The problem is that even if you measured other people according to God's law and found them wanting, if you were measured against God's law, you would fail the test. We don't measure up to any legitimate standard, God-honored or not. Whatever standard we create for ourselves, we cannot meet it. Because every one of us is a sinner. Every one of us is capable of great evil if given the opportunity. Jesus is saying the second you decide to look at another person and hold them up to some type of standard, you better check yourself for a second. I remember kind of a funny story. I remember meeting someone and I remember him saying to me, he said, and he was talking about boyfriends who would come and date his teenage daughters. And he said, the first thing I look at when they come is, do they keep their car clean? If a man can't keep his car clean, I don't know if he's worthy of my daughter. And I remember thinking about it for a second and going, huh. And then I looked outside and his truck was covered in dirt. You see, it's the fundamental thing that we do. We don't take mitigating circumstances or an explanation into account. In fact, we kind of like to leave the mitigating circumstances out. One of the other things that we do is we judge people based on personality and not truth as well. People we think are funny get away with murder, but people who we don't like, we have a super harsh standard for them, and so our standard is always changing as well. Which makes us even worse judges, and yet we think we're such good judges. But let's think about an example. Let's work it through a little bit. Think about our attitude to COVID regulations and COVID in general. I mean, one of what's happening is we have this certain opinion on COVID regulations and COVID, and then other people have a different opinion. And when they have a different opinion, we think less of them. This person, they're not as good of a person as me, because they obviously don't know what I know, right? But if we think it through, I mean, what if the other person has mitigating circumstances that you're not aware of? Maybe they have thought deeply about the issue. Maybe they have events in their past that have shown them the value of holding the opinion that they have. And maybe, just maybe, if you were in their shoes, you would have exactly the same opinion as they do. And if you finally talk to the person, you might discover that, well, your judgment was pretty foolish because their opinion's pretty convincing. In fact, maybe they're right and you're wrong. And sheepishly, you begin to wonder, wow, if they were so right and I was so wrong for so long, why did I misjudge this person so much? How did I get to the point where I misjudged them that far? And the fundamental problem, brothers and sisters, is that somehow, somewhere, we as human beings have become so proud that we have arrogated the right to sit in judgment on other people. We've decided that it's our right to judge people. We've decided, in effect, brothers and sisters, and this is the key point I want to drive home. We've decided, when we judge someone, the second we do, we've decided that we should be God too. In fact, this is what James is saying, and we read it in verses 11 through 12 of James 4. Right? He said, look what he says. He says, brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. And so by judging your brother and sister and judging that they fall short of the law and doing that unfairly on occasion, you're effectively judging God. You're saying, I'm a better judge of that person than God is. Because let's be serious, when you judge another person, you instinctively form a sentence on what they do as well. This person has a false view of COVID. God should punish them, or God should whatever to them. Why is God letting this happen to them? If I were God, I would change this person's life. I wouldn't let this person think this way. And instinctively, we're telling God that he's doing something wrong. And the problem is, we're really bad at being God. We're really bad at being God. And this is one of the things Jesus mentions in verse 3. He says, look, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? Jesus is saying, you're a terrible judge of other people because you are a terrible judge of yourself. Jesus says, how can you judge other people when clearly you're terrible at judging your own actions? And if you want God to do this and this to someone else, are you willing to let God do the same to you? And Jesus is saying, be careful when you judge other people, because you must recognize how self-deceived you really are. You would say, well, how can I be so blind to my self-deception? And the answer is pride. We're trying to be God. We think so highly of ourselves. We love to think we're such great people. And one of the mechanisms of maintaining this high view of self is to tear down other people. And eventually, when you become the kind of person who refuses to let your self-image fall, you become this hard, scaly person who doesn't have mercy or compassion for anyone. And Jesus says, blessed are the merciful. But to become merciful, you got to spend a lot of time looking at the plank in your own eye. And so this is where we come to our third point. Because in the third point, we're going to see that the gospel judges differently. The gospel says that every single one of us fails whatever standard we ever set. But the gospel also says that falling short of the standard need not condemn you. Because in the gospel of Jesus, even though you fall farther short than you could ever imagine, you're given whatever grace is necessary to forgive that gap. I mean, if Jesus judged you fairly, you would fail. But Jesus, or I should say it differently, Jesus does judge every single one of us fairly. That's why we read the law on Sunday, to judge ourselves fairly. But in Jesus, it's not a problem that he judges us fairly, because he forgives whatever failures we have, whatever part we fall short of that standard, he forgives. He gives the grace to save. In fact, he died on a cross so that your failures, your imperfections would be forgiven and you could be given eternal life with him. And in fact, just to repeat the point, when we read verse 1, we realize that there's more to this verse than I've said already. Wait, what does it say? Do not judge, or you too will be judged. Judged by who? This is more than the judgment between people. Jesus is saying, if you become an unfairly judgmental person, that very thing sits under God's judgment. If we decide to sit in judgment on other people, God will judge us for that very action. And the judging of another person is just as bad as whatever bad thing that other person did. And of course, Jesus condemns the judgmental person, and he says, you are in danger of the fire of hell. Look what he says in verse 5. He says, you hypocrite. Whoa. Remember, he's talking to his disciples. He's not talking about the Pharisees here. He's talking to us. He says, all you hypocrites. Ouch. He says, no, first take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Ouch, harsh, but unfortunately fair. He knows that the human heart is hypocritical. But we shouldn't get stuck on the sting of this verse. This verse actually gives us a lot of hope. Jesus is saying that it's possible for a community of people to exist on this earth in which people can fairly evaluate each other. There's a community on earth where judgmentalism is not the norm, or need not be. He's talking about the church. That's why he mentions the word brother. He's saying, look, in the church where I live, there's a place in which people can evaluate each other fairly and help each other overcome sin by seeing the truth about each other, and yet they're forgiving of each other and they love each other anyway. Because Jesus is saying that we need to deal with the sawdust in each other's eyes. He's not saying you shouldn't deal with the sawdust in your brother's eye. He's simply saying that if you do, you need to first think about the beams in your own. If you're honest about the beam in your eye, then people will be more willing to accept your comments on the sawdust. Because dealing with your beams is profoundly humbling. It makes you meek. For example, if I realize that I have an anger problem and I admit that, then the brother or sister that I'm speaking to about some other sin will be that much more likely to accept the comment. And one commentator says this. He says, look, the procedure for getting sawdust out of an eye is a very difficult operation. There's no organ that's more sensitive than the eye. The moment a finger touches the eye, it closes up. It's just so delicate. He says, so when you deal with the sawdust in someone's eye, what you need is sympathy and patience and calmness and coolness, and you need this utmost care. And so when you finally decide to help someone with their sawdust, man, there's a lot of preparation and an incredible amount of wisdom that goes into it. As much wisdom as an eye surgeon would need to work on a human eye. And so, brothers and sisters, to conclude, to become the kind of church and the kind of people where judgment is not the norm, but forgiveness and love is the norm. We have to live according to what Matthew 6, verse 14. He says, if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will forgive you. This is the opposite of judge not, lest you be judged. If you become the kind of person who is always ready to forgive. And of course, why would you be a person like that? Well, because Jesus is that person. Jesus looks at you and he sees you accurately. He sees everything about you, yet he forgives. He'll even forgive you if you murdered someone. And Jesus is saying, well, now you, my followers in my church, that's who you're going to be in me too. When I work in you, when I fill you with the Spirit, when I give you the power to live like me, that's who you're going to be. You're going to be forgiving people. You're going to be people who, no matter how bad the people are around you, you're willing you're not willing to compromise your view of them or to ignore what's happening to them, but you are willing to forgive them as much as is possible. You come with a starting point of love for the person. You want to see the best in them. You want to always be asking questions about why they think the way they do. Where do they come from? Why do they do what they do? If you disagree with them, you respect their disagreement. You voice your opinion maybe, but You understand that as you voice your opinion, you realize the other side probably, maybe they're right. And then when others fall or when others make mistakes, instead of giving you a sense of satisfaction, it grieves you. When someone falls and when someone makes a mistake, your heart is compelled to reach to them and to help them. You want to lift them back up. Which is what Jesus does to you in your life every time you fall. And so when we recognize how sinful we really are, when we look at the beams in our eyes, suddenly the specks in other people's eyes don't seem so outrageous anymore. And when someone's speck is really, or someone has something really bad in their life and they don't want to deal with it, we're also okay to pray to God, and God will work it out. God's the judge. He'll deal with that. And we're okay to leave it with Him. And this, brothers and sisters, is freedom. It's freedom to live a life that's judgment, that our judgments are accurate, where we're not unfairly critical of other people. Whatever criticism you give of other people that's unfair, it's a chain and ball behind you. Because now you can't love a person that you're too critical of. No, put it away in Jesus, and you will be able to love them and care for them, just as Jesus does with you. Because your Savior, if He judged you, you would fall. So remember, He's looking past your failings every single day and forgiving them every single moment of every single day and loving you with that full, powerful love. That's your God. Amen.